You didn't choose to grow up early. It wasn't wisdom that matured you. It was a lack of safety. The world around you didn't give you the option to stay innocent. You weren't mature for your age. You were scanning, tracking, pretending to play, while decoding emotional minefields dressed as dinner tables. This wasn't a personality trait. It was a survival adaptation. You weren't gifted. You were forced to evolve before your time. And Carl Jung warned us, the premature development of consciousness is a real danger. It breaks the unity of the personality. If you've ever clung to a four-letter code, INFJ, INTJ, INFP, just to make sense of your difference, this isn't about your type. It's about the trauma you had to dress up as insight. And in the next 25 minutes, or maybe less, you'll finally understand the real reason you felt so different, so early, long before any test tried to explain you. Because what shaped you wasn't a type. It was timing. It's about what happens when clarity comes too early, when emotional pattern recognition replaces play, when your maturity wasn't a gift, it was survival. And what it means when Jung's persona and shadow aren't abstract ideas, but the emotional machinery you've been running on since childhood. In my last video, I broke down how the MBTI test borrowed from Jung's original work and what it left out. If you haven't watched it yet, it's worth exploring. Not because it gives you a label, but because it helps you understand what those labels missed. But this video isn't about the system. This one is about the story underneath it. And if you've never taken the test or don't trust your result, you're not excluded. Because what we're about to explore isn't based on categories. It's based on psychological timing and the invisible cost of growing up too fast. You don't always remember the moment it started, but something inside you shifted. While other kids were immersed in play without consequence, your mind was already tracking tone shifts, decoding adults, predicting chaos. You weren't playing. You were defending, simulating, holding the room together before it could fall apart. And that wasn't intuition. That was survival. You weren't really playing. You were performing. Being a child felt more like pretending than living, because your nervous system had already shifted into pattern analysis mode. You weren't present. You were preemptive. Crowds drained you. Group dynamics felt like emotional noise. And while other kids were absorbing innocence, you were absorbing contradiction. This isn't sensitivity. It's cognitive hypervigilance, a system trained to catch unspoken threats before they become danger. Carl Jung warned us about this. He called it the formation of a complex, an emotionally charged cluster of thoughts, feelings, and memories built around unresolved threat. And he told us, a complex can be repressed and forgotten, and yet it remains active. That's why the fatigue never really left. You were doing emotional labor years before your psyche had the structure to hold it. From the outside, it looked like maturity, but on the inside, it felt like pressure. Constant, quiet, inescapable. You didn't feel old because you were wise. You felt old because you were over-adapted. You felt old because you had already built what Jung called the persona, the mask we wear to function in society. But Carl Jung warned us, when the persona is built too early, it stops being a bridge. It becomes a barrier. You weren't using your persona to express yourself. You were using it to survive. And behind that mask, something else was forming. Something Jung called the shadow. All the parts of you that didn't feel safe to show. Your anger, your sadness, your softness, your needs. They didn't disappear. They got buried. Jung told us, the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. And he made it clear, it's not evil, it's exiled. It's everything we had to cut off in order to stay accepted. So no, you weren't broken. You were accelerated, not by wisdom, by exposure. This is not the story of dysfunction. It's the anatomy of premature awakening. And Jung had a name for that too. He called it premature individuation. When the ego separates from the unconscious too early, not because of growth, but because of trauma. And he warned us, the premature development of consciousness is a real danger because it breaks up the unity of the personality. So the real question isn't, what's wrong with you? The real question is, Who taught your nervous system that it couldn't afford to be young? And what part of your real self did you abandon to stay alive in a world that didn't feel safe? Let's be precise. You didn't grow up fast because you were wise. You adapted because you were unsupported. You didn't become perceptive because you were gifted. You became perceptive because you had to be. Carl Jung warned us about this. He said that when the outer world becomes unstable, the inner world accelerates. The psyche overdevelops the conscious mind to compensate for what the environment lacks. And the child's mind doesn't get curious, it gets strategic. This isn't awareness, it's overfunction. Jung once said, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." And that's what you were doing, compensating for a pain that had no name. You weren't curious about adult behavior. You were decoding it because no one explained it. And your nervous system couldn't afford the luxury of misunderstanding. So you started tracking tone shifts, micro expressions, energy patterns, behavior loops, not for fun, for survival. This is what Jung called the formation of defensive consciousness, or what he sometimes referred to as the inflation of the ego. When the conscious mind grows too large, too fast, and separates from the unconscious in an attempt to impose control. And that's when it happened. Your mind said, if no one's going to protect me, I'll figure this out myself. And that's exactly what it did. You didn't stay a child. You became a pattern recognition system. And over time, that system became your identity. Your persona, the social mask Jung described as a tool for adapting to others, became fused with yourself. He told us, the persona is only a mask of the collective psyche, a mask that feigns individuality, but in reality is collective. And again, the persona is a system of behavior by which the individual adapts to society. But yours wasn't just adaptation, it was self-protection. And it was built too early, before there was a real self underneath to anchor it. So instead of a bridge between you and the world, it became a shell you couldn't take off. You weren't expressing who you were. You were managing how others saw you. You became the version of yourself that made people comfortable, the one who smiled on command, who stayed quiet in chaos, who predicted emotional storms before they arrived, like a psychic. But beneath all that, your shadow was growing. The shadow, as Jung described it, holds everything you had to suppress in order to survive. Your playfulness, your defiance, your softness, your needs, even your joy. Jung told us, the shadow is the thing a person has no wish to be. And again, it's not evil, it's exiled. It's the part of you that got locked away the moment your real feelings became inconvenient for someone else. But Jung also told us something else. The shadow contains the gold, meaning the very parts you had to hide are also the ones holding your life force. He wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And you didn't get the chance to do that. You weren't ready. But your environment forced it anyway. So the psyche split. Your outer self adapted. Your inner self fractured. That's not maturity. It's compensatory intelligence. The mind overdeveloping in one direction to make up for the emotional stability it never had. And here's the real psychological cost. The more accurate your perception became, the more isolated you felt. Because most people around you didn't have to perceive anything at all. That wasn't depression, it was misalignment. You were living in a world that punished clarity, and when clarity isn't shared, it becomes isolation. You didn't skip childhood because you were ready. You skipped it because the world you were born into didn't protect it. You didn't get to believe, someone's got me. So your psyche became the adult. And the more you saw, the more alone you felt. Because people who didn't have to see what you saw could afford to stay innocent. You couldn't. And that wasn't a personality trait. That was a survival adaptation. But here's what no one told you. This over-functioning mind you built, it doesn't just exhaust you, it tricks you into thinking something is wrong with you. Let's unpack that next. Let's challenge a false frame. Many early aware children grow up to be told they're depressed, But Jung would disagree with that diagnosis, at least in the way it's casually thrown around. He told us, "Depression is like a woman in black. If she turns up, don't shoo her away. Invite her in, offer her a seat, and listen to what she wants to say." Jung didn't view depression as weakness. He saw it as a signal, a psychic message that the outer personality no longer matches the inner truth. But that's not exactly what happened to you. What you experienced wasn't dysfunction, it was compression. Compression means your psychological system was absorbing more emotional data than it was built to process at that stage of development. It's like running adult software on child hardware. This aligns with what Jung described as a tightening of the conscious field. When the ego becomes overwhelmed by content it cannot yet integrate, you weren't equipped to interpret marital tension, decode adult contradictions, hold relational instability. But you did, and that overloaded your system, so you shut down. Not because you were mentally ill, because your nervous system went into emergency conservation mode. Compression looks like numbness, not from apathy, but from overload. Withdrawal, not from disinterest, but from saturation. Silence, not from repression, but from exhaustion. Jung wrote that, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent." What happens when that burden is emotional complexity, silence, and contradiction? Answer: the child becomes the container for things that should never have been theirs to hold. And because your insight outpaced your language, you couldn't explain what was happening. So the world explained it for you. You're depressed. You believe them. But Jung taught us that misdiagnosis of the soul is one of the great modern tragedies. So let's be clear. You were never emotionally weak. You were psychologically overloaded by clarity, silenced by confusion, and misread by a world that only understands pain when it becomes visible. And that clarity, the clarity you couldn't turn off, that wasn't a gift. It was a burden your body was trying to process without a blueprint. You weren't mentally ill. You were overexposed to contradictions you were too young to name, and your system did exactly what it was supposed to do. It compressed, not to break you, but to preserve what little energy you had left. If that reframes something inside you, say it out loud or in the comments. I wasn't depressed, I was compressed. Let others find that sentence like a lifeline. But even if you know that now, what does it mean about who you really are? What does it say about your role, your identity, your mind? That's what we'll decode next. So if you weren't depressed, but compressed, then you're not broken. You're over-adapted. But what does that actually mean about who you are? Not just what you've been through, but what your mind is designed to do. Carl Jung taught that when the psyche is exposed to too much, too early, the ego doesn't just fracture, it adapts. It evolves into something highly specialized. And the result? You don't become broken. You become different. Let's say it clearly. You weren't emotionally ahead. You were psychologically out of sync with your environment. Your development didn't follow the standard timeline. It followed an archetypal one. Jung wouldn't call this an illness. He'd call it unconscious individuation, a version of the lifelong psychological process he defined as becoming whole, but one that began in the dark, without guidance, without preparation, without choice. He wrote, "Individuation means becoming a single, homogeneous being, and implies becoming one's own self. But when that process is forced, it fragments you before it frees you. You didn't begin individuation through curiosity. You began it through necessity, not because you were ready, but because no one protected the self that was forming." So what does that look like? It looks like a mind built for depth, functioning in a world built for performance. It looks like early existential discomfort, feeling something was off even before you had words. Hyper-responsiveness to contradiction, hypocrisy, and unspoken tension. Pattern recognition that doesn't stop at systems, but maps people. A chronic psychic dissonance in shallow environments, and the haunting sense of being alone, even when surrounded. You weren't socially awkward. You were developmentally misaligned. You weren't hard to connect with. You were speaking a language most people don't even recognize. Jung once said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important." That was your reality, not isolation by distance, but by depth. You weren't playing the same psychological game as the others. While they were reacting, you were mapping. While they were bonding, you were observing. Not because you didn't want connection, but because connection demanded self-suppression, and you'd already exiled too much of yourself just to be allowed in the room. Jung would say this is the signature of the early aware, not someone who's too sensitive, but someone whose psychic structure was forced to grow under pressure. You weren't built for shallow spaces. You were built for synthesis, for systems, for symbolism, but no one told you. So you tried to compress yourself to fit. You translated clarity into safe opinions. You shrank your voice until it became tolerable. And every time you did, you betrayed the one part of you that never lied, your clarity. Let's name the truth directly. You weren't a failed version of normal. You were a prototype for something else entirely. Something that doesn't perform in chaos, but decodes it. Jung said those who begin individuation early often walk a lonelier road. And he was right, because when the self awakens before the world is ready, the cost is psychic tension and constant fatigue. That's what you've carried, not weakness, but weight. The cost of seeing what others couldn't hold. And while forced individuation may have started the path, Jung warned us, the premature development of consciousness is a real danger. It breaks the unity of the personality. He also said, individuation does not shut one out from the world, but gathers the world to itself. But that didn't happen for you. You weren't gathering the world. You were avoiding it because it couldn't reflect what you saw. So let's name your psychological blueprint with precision. You're not neurotic, you're untethered because your internal system was built for integration. But your world only rewarded performance. You asked questions no one could answer. Why do people lie? Why are we pretending this is fine? Why don't they say what they really mean? And when the silence stretched too long, you did what Jung said we do. You turned the projection inward. Projection, in Jungian psychology, means assigning what we can't accept or don't understand onto others or ourselves. And when no answers came from outside, you made the confusion your fault. You called yourself broken. You called your silence weakness. You assumed your difference meant deficiency, but what you actually needed was mirroring. That's the tragedy. You thought your mind was the problem, but it was the mirror to a world that never reflected you back. And Jung would say you weren't in a breakdown. You were undergoing a forced confrontation with the self. The self, in his model, is the totality of who you are, conscious and unconscious, known and unknown. It is the deepest blueprint of your psyche. And yours began to awaken, years too early, without the environment needed to support its weight. So no, you weren't weak. You were overloaded. You weren't broken. You were becoming. And now you know it. And your fatigue, your constant psychic tension, was the cost of seeing what others weren't ready to face. So let's stop pretending this is weakness. Let's stop misdiagnosing insight. Let's stop asking early aware minds to translate themselves into smaller formats just to be tolerated. You didn't ask for this depth, but now that you have it, you have to learn how to carry it. Let's build the framework. By now you know, you weren't broken, you weren't behind, you were compressed, over-adapted, prematurely aware. But now comes the harder truth. You still have to carry it. All that perception, all that contradiction, all that insight you can't unsee, you can't reverse it, you can't go back and reclaim the innocence you lost. But Jung wouldn't ask that of you, because individuation is not about returning to who you were. It's about becoming who you actually are. So how do you hold it without letting it crush you? Carl Jung never promised peace to those who awakened early. He warned us that individuation is not comfortable. It's disorienting, it's isolating, but it is the only path toward wholeness. So no, you can't undo your early awareness. You can't go back and reclaim the childhood you didn't get. but you can build a new internal structure strong enough to hold the weight. Here's what that looks like. 1. Convert perception into creation. Your mind will keep scanning. It will keep tracking patterns. It will keep recognizing dynamics others don't even register. You can't turn that off, but you can redirect it. Jung said, "The hands will solve a mystery that the intellect has struggled with in vain." Meaning, if you don't express your insight, it will start consuming you from the inside. So put it somewhere, into systems, into writing, into design, into frameworks, into questions that reshape the world around you. This isn't emotional venting. This is functional expression. You weren't built to ruminate. You were built to construct. If your clarity has no channel, it will become obsession. If your depth has no form, it will become fatigue. So create, not for attention, but for integration. You weren't made to contain your insight. You were made to construct something with it. Second, stop performing emotional legibility. You've spent years trying to make others comfortable with your complexity, downplaying what you see, smoothing your sharp edges, simplifying your language so others wouldn't feel threatened. But Jung warned us about this. He said when the persona, the social mask, becomes dominant, the self retreats. He wrote, "The persona is what one is not, but what oneself and others think one is." You don't owe anyone an easier version of yourself. Speak in your native frequency. Not everyone will understand it, but the right minds will recognize it immediately. This will reduce your social fatigue by half, not because you're making fewer connections, but because you're no longer translating your soul into other people's dialects. Stop curating your intelligence. Stop softening your clarity. Preserve your signal. Let others rise to meet it. 3. Design environments that match your mind. You are not avoidant. You are context selective. Shallow spaces will always drain you. Superficial dynamics will always fragment you. You weren't designed for small talk and half-truths. You need clarity, precision, contradiction that's welcome, tension that's integrated. That means conversations that challenge assumptions. People who recognize paradox as a sign of intelligence, and environments where being quiet doesn't make you suspicious. Jung once said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But if there's no reaction, you don't owe it your energy. If your surroundings don't reflect your internal depth, you will begin to collapse inward. Not because you're broken, because your cognition is underfed. This is not about being high maintenance. It's about being high functioning in low nutrient environments. Stop mistaking exhaustion for humility. You're not tired because you think too much. You're tired because you're carrying insight in places that reward ignorance. You don't need healing. You need architecture. You don't need to be normal. You need to stop apologizing for being neurologically awake in a world that teaches people to stay asleep. You don't need rest. You need resonance. Because clarity is not the problem. Isolation is. And when your clarity finally has a structure to live in, you stop collapsing under it and you start building with it. Carl Jung didn't teach us how to be normal. He taught us how to be whole. You weren't born tired. You were born tuned in, into a system that didn't know what to do with your frequency. And you've already begun that work. You didn't wait for permission. You adapted, you endured, and now you're remembering. You don't need to fix your sensitivity. You don't need to dilute your perception. You need to honor the architecture of your mind and build your life around it. If this video spoke to the part of you that always felt too alone in your depth, then you're not alone anymore. This channel wasn't built to explain you. It was built to stand beside you, to speak in the language you've always carried but rarely heard. So subscribe, not because it helps the algorithm, but because clarity needs a home. And so do you. And if you want to reclaim that truth, write this in the comments. I was built for clarity, not just to feel it, but to structure it, to live it, to become it. Because if the world doesn't give you space, you build one. And then you fill it with others who were exiled for the same reason you were. Not because you were wrong, but because you saw too much, too early.